Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kara Romano, and I'm the Executive Editor of Consumer Goods Technology. I would like to welcome you all to today's web seminar, a continuing part of the Consumer Goods Web Connection series. We appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us today, and would also like to thank IBM for their support in sponsoring this event. Today's discussion will be focused on trends in sales and marketing, highlighting the results of the 2014 Sales and Marketing Research Report, which is conducted by IDC Manufacturing Insights and CGT. And I think Simon and I decided this was our 5th year doing this research with IDC. So we definitely have year-over-year trends, and I think that's what makes this research that much richer. So for our session today, we'll have an interactive discussion that Simon Ellis of IDC will lead, and he'll share the results of the research, and then we're going to have a dialogue with our panelists around each topic. So first, I'd like to introduce Simon Ellis, who leads the Supply Chain Strategies practice at Manufacturing Insights, one of IDC's industry research companies. Within the supply chain practice, he specializes in advising clients on supply chain network design, global sourcing, transportation, logistics, lean, Six Sigma, and more. Simon has almost 30 years of experience in the consumer goods industry, working across all major areas of the supply chain. Prior to IDC, Simon was the supply chain futurist for Unilever North America and was responsible for leading the implementation of key new technologies that impacted the future of the Unilever supply chain. Our second panelist will be Kara Taylor, the former Vice President of Financial Operations for Sony Pictures Home Entertainment, where she was responsible for groups handling pricing, trade spend management, contract compliance, and accounts payable. She has spent the last 4.5 years working on the company's trade promotions management strategy and system enhancements. Kara has held various posts during more than 20 years of working in the entertainment and entertainment distribution industries, the past 14 for Sony Pictures Home Entertainment. And last but not least, we'll be joined by Anthony Bigornia, who is the global leader of the IBM Consumer Products Industry Solutions portfolio. Anthony has over 17 years of experience serving clients in the consumer products and retail industries as both a strategy consultant and solutions executive. In his current role, Anthony is responsible for setting IBM's cross-brand industry strategy and defining the cross-brand portfolio of IBM solutions tailored specifically to the needs of the consumer products clients. In addition, Anthony's delivered a broad range of business technology and operations strategy consulting engagements for clients in North America, Europe, and Latin America. So I certainly have an all-star cast with me today, so a lot of good questions and a lot of good answers. As with all of our events, one of our goals is to make them as interactive as possible and to get feedback from you throughout. So please notice the Q&A function on the left side below the presenter headshots, and if you've got questions of our panelists, please use this Q&A section to ask them. The slides and the report itself can be downloaded from the Event Resource Center in this same area, and a replay will be available on our website for many platforms, including smartphones and tablets. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for attending, and let's get going. So Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kara, and welcome to everybody who has taken time out of their day, whether the morning, the afternoon, or the evening, to join us live here for this webcast, and also for the folks that will invariably download the recording. So what I'm going to do is, as Kara mentioned, I'm going to cover 4 topics that we included in the report this year. These are topics that I think are of great interest to the audience. They're of great interest to folks in the consumer products industry. It's trade promotion management, downstream data, direct to consumer, and then integrated business planning. I think, as Kara said, I think what we'll do is, since we have such expertise, I think, today here on the webcast, at the end of each topic, I will actually ask a few questions of the other folks, both questions that have come in from the audience, and also ones that we used at the live event back in New York last week. So, from a TPM perspective, I think that we've certainly seen, and Kara alluded to this, we've done this report now with CGT for 5 years. This is the 5th one, and I think we've seen some sort of interesting trends over the course of those 5 years. The data here on the slide is just from this year, 2014, and from 2013. And I mean, it's, in some ways, as we said in the report, I think it's, it's a bit of a mixed bag, I suppose. I think we certainly continue to see an improvement focus. One of the things that I think was very encouraging for me personally from the early years of doing this report, where for a lot of companies it was about, and we talked about this at the event in New York, where it was about very much, reducing the trade promotion budget. We've seen, I think, a pretty consistent shift away from that. Not that I think companies wouldn't still, sign up for reducing the budget, but that it's very much about this sort of improvement focus, right? It's very much about, and it's the things here on the slide, right? It's very much about, collaborating internally to design better promotions. It's about working with retail partners to design better promotions. Certainly the ability to analyze the results, I think, is far better today than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago. There's that kind of classic comment from, and I'm not even sure who originally said it, but it's the classic comment from the industry that, half my promotions are profitable. I just don't know which half. I think we're certainly well past that. And I think we're at the point where, for many companies, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but for many companies, we are seeing this kind of general trend to driving more effective promotions and getting sort of better sort of post-promotion analytics. But I do think it's it's fair to make the observation based on the data from this year and last year. Is there perhaps a little less enthusiasm for trade promotion management? I mean, we see pretty consistently here, lower percentages for each of the responses. The sample size is different, right? So it may simply be a sort of a statistical anomaly. But I do think it's fair to sort of wonder whether whether there isn't a little bit of sort of jadedness creeping into TPM, and whether there isn't sort of less enthusiasm, or perhaps it's, and I suspect this isn't probably the case either, or perhaps enough companies have feel like they've sort of solved the problem, and so it's sort of become what Lean Six Sigma became, right? It went from being sort of a department with a chief Lean Six Sigma officer to something that was kind of built into the business. I mean, maybe we're going there for TPM. But I think it's certainly fair to note, and we did in the report that TPM and its various acronym brethren are part of the integrated business planning process, right? I mean, as companies think more holistically about enterprise planning, and not just sort of the traditional kind of supply chain and sales and operations planning, but a much broader kind of enterprise planning effort. The trade promotion really is integral to that mix, right? I mean, it's certainly part of the sales plan. It's to some degree part of the marketing plan as well, and it's certainly part of the financial and supply chain plans. So I think as we think about trade promotion planning, and we think about sort of some of the goals that we've seen in sort of the last 3 to 5 years, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that it really is sort of integral to that kind of broader planning effort. So kind of given that perspective, let me ask of the panelists, and Karen, maybe I'll start with you if that's okay. What do you think about that sort of notion of I think we used the term kind of passé when we were in New York a couple of weeks ago. But what do you think about that sort of notion that TPM is old news, and is that in your view correct, or are we sort of misreading the data?
Hi everyone. Thank you, Simon. I think in talking with people, especially in New York, and having people ask questions, I think there's a broad range. I don't think it's passé. I think you have your companies that have kind of I don't know if I would say solve it, but it has become so part of their process that they're now moving on to optimization and how to use that and how to weave in other sorts of data and use it throughout the organization. Then you have people who or companies that are kind of where we were at Sony Pictures, where we're taking in the data, we're making better decisions, but since our strategy is changing, we have to change our trade spend strategy and continue to look at the measures and figure out how to weave it through the organization, because we're just starting to do that, to put it into more of the integrated business planning. And then I think you have a cadre of newer, younger companies, smaller companies that are starting to realize the spend is incredibly important, and how do we manage it? So I think you have companies at all sorts of the kind of growth curve on TPM, so I would never say it's passé, because it's still such a huge part of the spend that as your business evolves, you have to constantly revisit your trade spend strategy, what you're doing, how you're doing it, how it feathers through the organization, and that means constantly relooking at your processes around it, your training of your salespeople, and how you keep people up to date. So I don't know, as long as we're spending this money, I'm not sure that it ever really becomes passé. You just move to different levels of education acuity at it, and then you redevelop your strategy as your business changes, if it does. It's kind of my thought about it.
Yeah, hey Simon, this is Anthony. Just to chime in to support Kara's comment, I think she said it really well. The only thing that I would maybe slightly add to change the conversation a bit is I agree that we don't see, as a solution provider perspective, that TPM is becoming passé. However, I do think that there is some TPM fatigue, which is a slightly nuanced sort of description of I think the attitude towards some companies around TPM, and I think that is partly driven by the fact, as Kara mentioned, that and another way to look at it is I think the industry's lowest common denominator kind of baseline capability in trade has clearly risen in the last number of years as people have invested in this area. They realize they need to continue to invest more and are focusing the next wave of investments on analytics and effectiveness versus maybe efficiency-based improvements in prior phases or initiatives. But it is still clearly a top strategic agenda. Although I do sense personally that when you go in to talk to sales and sales finance folks, that there is a bit of fatigue because we've been trying for so long to solve the problem. We're getting better, and we still have a long way to go. But it's a journey, and we've definitely not hit the pinnacle, but we're moving on the way up. But it's creating some fatigue as we navigate that journey.
Right. Interesting. So I saw there was a question actually that had come in from the audience, and it's a fairly sort of neat segue, I think. And maybe Anthony, I'll start with you. Is this kind of notion of trade promotion management versus trade promotion optimization? Is there a logical order to the two? Or is trade promotion optimization simply a way to sort of maybe rename something and sort of beat the fade, or kind of sort of get past some of that fatigue? What's your sense? Are TPM, TPO very different things? Do you do one? I mean, I guess I tend to think you do M before you do O, but kind of what are you guys seeing in the market?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and it's one that we address very often. It's clearly top of mind of folks. I do think that historically the attitude was clearly to start with TPM, sort of get your ducks in a row first, and make sure that you've got a set of standardized and automated processes before you begin looking at layering incremental capabilities around analytics and effectiveness on top of those. I still agree that is the right way to approach it, particularly because, as we all know, fixing the trade problem, for lack of a better term, is much more than a technology exercise. So half of the battle is getting the processes standardized, and then using technology to help enforce that and automate it, and being able to get a better understanding of who you're spending in what amounts, let alone are you spending it effectively. But having said that, what I do think has changed is I think there are some new technologies, for lack of a better term, that allow companies to be able to test and learn much faster than maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where I think that it was a much more discrete transition from TPM to, let's call it TPO. I think that what we are seeing are leading companies actually beginning to test and learn in smaller scale, let's use the word implementations, in parallel with the traditional TPM implementation, starting to test and learn around either a specific geography, a specific brand, or a specific customer. Some of what would traditionally have been considered TPO, and maybe 5 years ago we would have waited until the TPM deployment was fully fleshed out, if you will. So I still think conceptually it's the right approach, but there's ways to accelerate the transition between TPM and TPO today that didn't exist maybe 5 years ago.
Yep, no, that makes sense. And then I guess just lastly before moving on to the next topic, given the slide that's up there and the fact that kind of pointed trade promotion planning at sort of the sales side of the business, Kara, is in your experience, who owns the trade promotion improvement process? Is it ultimately sales, or is it, as a sort of finance person who implemented a lot of these things, or do you tend to think of it more from a financial perspective?
I think, at least in my experience, just because I was the longest standing member of the team and happened to work in finance and do sales finance work, it tended to live and breathe with more of a finance role. However, that's kind of shifted in the last probably year and a half at our organization, with the realization that you have to have a strong presence from sales. And as we started to, I think, our next big project was taking the estimates and everything out of the TPM system and feeding it to our demand partners over on the production side for production and planning purposes. Then you start to realize that there are a lot more players that need to be kind of integrated into the process and understand at least the process behind trade promotions and what we're doing, how we're doing it, how it goes out, how you want to take in the estimates, how sales are putting their estimates in, how they see it. So I think we've kind of turned the corner and kind of realized that it's a much bigger issue or a much bigger process that involves not just sales finance, but also needs to take into account, and at least in our world, in the production and demand planners as well. Because if they don't understand what sales is trying to do, the numbers really mean nothing to them. They just come through the system in a vacuum. So, I think now we've kind of broadened our approach to kind of, teach everyone kind of what the basics of our trade promotion strategy. So we're all on the same page when we start to talk about how we plan out releases and go to market with our top 10 customers and things of that nature. So I think it's kind of evolved as we've enhanced and kind of increased the capabilities of the system and asked for more when we start to do our JBPs and with our bigger customers.
Yep. No, that makes sense. Okay. So let me move to the next topic. We could talk about trade promotion, I think, just on its own for the hour. But I want to cover the other topics as well. So downstream data. This was something that was near and dear to my heart for many years, and I sort of remember thinking that by 2015 we'll kind of have everybody playing the game and we'll be getting data. But I think the question that always got asked of me when I was on the manufacturer side from retailers, which I think is a question that perhaps is still in many cases not fully answered, is retailers used to ask me, well, we're not going to provide you with lots and lots of downstream data unless you show us how it's going to benefit us, and it was always perhaps not so easy to do that, and so we sort of had this kind of chicken and egg thing going on. And so I think it's fascinating to me as we sort of did the survey with Kara and the CGT folks to sort of see kind of how downstream data has changed. I still think that perhaps we'd not made as much progress as I sort of thought. Perhaps maybe it was irrationally optimistic in 2000, but perhaps maybe we've not made enough progress, not gone as far as I would have thought we would have. We still see a lot of data coming from third-party providers, and maybe at the end of the day they're kind of complementary sources. But I think I haven't seen as much kind of direct sourced data directly from retailer as I thought, perhaps. Even though sources clearly are switching, right? I mean, I think we're clearly seeing manufacturers move more to getting data more directly. Perhaps it's because it can be more granular that way. Perhaps it can be more timely. We all talk about real-time data, and I think certainly when you start talking about downstream data, I think the argument that getting it in real time is a pretty compelling one, which may not always be the case with all forms of data. But I guess Anthony, Kara, maybe where I would start here in terms of a question, and Anthony, maybe I'll start with you, is, what kinds of business benefits are we seeing in the industry? Certainly my sense is that consumer products companies are using downstream data to further refine sort of the demand sides of their supply chains and get to better forecasting. But I also think maybe we haven't seen some of that sort of push back into the supply side of the supply chain that perhaps we thought we might 10 years ago. So Anthony, what's your sense as to the kinds of business benefits that companies are getting out of this downstream data?
Yeah, another great question. So first of all, I think that if we look at downstream data I'll use the traditional use of the term, meaning primarily customer-related data, sell-through data, and other retail-related data, and focus on that for a second. And then, maybe I think the situation's also, I think, quickly evolving to companies moving beyond that into other consumer and shopper data. But if we focus on sort of the traditional definition of downstream data first, we are seeing the typical benefits that we've been exposed to for the last number of years around demand forecasting and supply chain planning and supply chain execution by getting better visibility to what's happening at the store level and reducing the bullwhip effect and enabling better execution. So whether that's in reduced working capital and or revenue uplifts and better promotional effectiveness by being able to reduce out of stocks at a store level, I think those continue to expose themselves, for lack of a better word, or be achieved in the industry. I do think that there are a number of players, though, that are actually taking it further upstream. So linking customer downstream data with other variables to do more supply side or commodity optimization, right? So we've seen in a number of food and beverage companies where they're, for the first time, really being able to link and integrate what's happening on the customer and consumer sell-through level with purchases on the supply side and the ability to make relatively near real-time decisions on supply side purchases and supply side allocation of product, right? Particularly in categories where certain raw materials can have a number of different uses, like milk is an obvious one. I mean, I didn't know it until I started working with a milk company, but there's hundreds of uses of milk. Some milk manufacturers using commodity price optimization to be able to better forecast, depending on expectations around pricing and demand for different outputs of milk, for lack of a better term, what is the best way to use the raw input of milk as it goes through the manufacturing process, whether it's in glue or in paint or in yogurt or in actual sort of like straight old milk. So I do think that we're seeing some pretty interesting uses of downstream data getting pushed back up to the more on the supply side, but agreed that it is still somewhat, I think, dependent on the product category and the sophistication of the company. It's not really for the faint of heart.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And Kara, is it? I know, when we were on the panel week before last, that we talked a little bit about this sort of notion of, I have this running joke that I use about the supply chain hall of fame of overused terms, right? And maybe downstream data is sort of is a pending inductee into that Hall of Fame of overused terms. I'm what's your perspective on that? Because I think maybe is a term that we use too much, and it sort of it you lose the sort of the specificity of what I should be looking at and when I should be looking at it.
I think it is, as I think Anthony's has brought up in his examples. There are so many different types of data and so much you can do with it. Even within, and we've been taking in, I think we're very lucky as an organization. We get 70% of our POS data directly. So we do subscribe to data. We've been getting this POS data for a while. We use it to vendor manage some of our clients and our customers. We use it to create credits and things like that, and also for analytic purposes around forecasting. But we've been doing that for years. But when you start to take in, especially in the digital space, large numbers of transactions, there's obviously a lack of direct POS data from our European entities and other customers around the world. But then you start, I think, it's such what you can also take in from consumer-facing websites from your customers. There's all sorts of data that I think you can take in, and I think as our organization specifically, we've started to take in subscription data, consumer data, loyalty data, all waves of information that I think has just overloaded us. And unless you specifically know what you want to achieve using that data, you get lost in trying to figure out the best way to use it, the best way to house it, how to pull it into analytics. So to Anthony's point, it's not for the faint of heart, and you have to really know what streams of data you're getting, what you want to do with it, and how you're going to do that. Because if you just pull it into a data warehouse and hope that you can query against it, even in our small company, it's so much data that you start to choke yourself and you lose sight of what your real goal is. So I think you have to structure really what you expect to achieve in your goals around specific lines of data as you start to develop your strategy around how you're going to use it.
Yeah. It's funny. I had for many years. I had a cartoon that I had cut out that I had pinned to the wall of my office, and it basically was this woman sitting behind a desk, and in front of the desk was the delivery guy, UPS guy, FedEx guy, whomever, with a ham truck with 3 boxes, and was holding an envelope, and the caption underneath said, here are three big boxes of information and one small, 3 big boxes of data and one small envelope of useful information. And I think I wish I'd kept it, because it's become so true that as the data has grown, companies' ability to analyze it. Let's be honest, right? All companies have less and less eyeballs looking at stuff. How do you actually manage that increasingly that increasing amount of data for those key insights? And as a business, if you fail to capture the key insights, somebody somewhere will be only too happy to point that out to you, right? So it's a fascinating, if enormously challenging space. Great. So let me move on to the next topic, and I don't know. This is the one, I suppose, that for me, this sort of notion of direct to consumer, that of the 4 topics in the report, perhaps the most controversial one, because I see very different perspectives. And Anthony, I know you guys at IBM have a somewhat different perspective than we had in the report. Certainly at least in terms of the data from the survey, it does seem that consumer products companies, whereas 2 or 3 years ago they were very keen to sort of explore direct commercial relationships with consumers, so actually selling products to consumers either through their websites or through some sort of third-party online mechanism. It does seem to me that we've seen this sort of subtle shift more to saying, well, hang on a second, maybe actually it's more about having a brand relationship, and we can sort of debate what that really means. So we have that sort of that conversation with the consumer. We have that relationship with the consumer from a brand perspective, but not necessarily selling directly to the consumer, that will sort of leave that to sort of more traditional outlets, more traditional retail, and then again this kind of subtle uptick in the notion of kind of no plans. But I guess I have a couple of questions, and Anthony, maybe we'll start with you again. Is that sort of notion of a brand relationship versus a commercial one ultimately an artificial distinction that doesn't really matter? That at the end of the day, for the consumer products company, it's about making your products available. My colleague Leslie Hand coined the term omnichannel years ago. But is it at the end of the day simply about making your product available in wherever the consumer decides they want to shop for it? I mean, is that ultimately what we're talking about here?
The short answer is I believe yes, right? That when it comes down to it, I think one of the truly sort of fundamental shifts in the marketplace of late has been away from this notion of two moments of truth. We all remember sort of A.G. Lafley's two moments of truth from whatever it was, 10 years ago or so. I now typically use the term infinite moments of truth, right? So people are shopping 24/7, and shopping in the broadest sense of the word. They're researching about products. They're researching about usage occasions. They're purchasing 24/7 on the train, at home, on the bed, in the store, while they're watching TV. And so I think that, I think leading companies have begun to understand that because the path to purchase is no longer as linear as it once was, and it's this infinitely complex sort of dynamic path to purchase, that CPG companies need to deliver a seamless experience across and around this entire path to purchase. And part of that is providing the option for a consumer to buy when, where, and how they want. And how that gets delivered, whether that's through a third party or through an e-tailer or directly by the CPG company, I mean, there's nuances there and debates. But I think we've seen, anyways, a very much an uptick on this notion of creating this seamless experience to be there as a brand whenever, wherever, however the consumer wants to interact with the brand, and that does include purchasing. So, simply put, have a buy now button ready wherever and whenever a consumer wants to use one.
Yep. No, that makes sense. And Kara, I know because again we talked about this in some detail at the event in New York. I know you guys are not big into direct to consumer necessarily, but you had mentioned that you get a lot of requests, from retailers, from customers to kind of support their kind of sort of consumer web offerings. So does that sort of, from a Sony perspective, does that in effect mean it's about the brand relationship, or is it really just sort of facilitating the sales process on behalf of your customers?
Great question. I think because of the nature of our product, just the movies on disc, basically, you're dealing with an intellectual property right. So we've been very, 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 we don't work in the direct-to-consumer space. Plus, since I don't sell the electronics, our brand is, no one is looking for a Sony Pictures movie. They're looking for a specific movie. So really, you're looking at, our movies are more of our, each movie is a brand, each star is its own brand in and of itself. So kind of the tact we've taken is you kind of, from initial box office in theaters through to the home video release, most of our direct-to-consumer efforts are really at pumping up the movie, the star, what they're in, and whatnot. And that's not to say that we don't, there isn't a direct relationship with some of our partners to promote the movie from box office through to home video release, because we do that type of work. But from a direct-to-consumer perspective, we have, because of the nature of, Walmart owning Vudu, the digital download site, Target having Target Ticket and having launched that, and a lot of the other large, large telecom and cablers also getting into the on-demand or direct-to-consumer sell-through of downloads of product like Netflix does with their streaming or stream-to-own. We have been tapped because it is an expensive, setting up a website like that is an expensive proposition. So we have been tapped by a number of our customers to help them develop their direct-to-consumer brand for downloading, streaming, download to own, things of that nature. So that's kind of where we've been tapped more on the direct-to-consumer market outside of the individual efforts around the promotion of a film, which we consider more the marketing side of the house rather than the commercial side of the house. Now, they all dovetail into each other as, you get closer and closer to a release, especially a large release, because then you have, buy buttons, this, pre-sale buttons, that, but, on the different websites. But that's kind of where we've been spending most of our direct-to-consumer money, either on the direct-to-marketing side, just, supporting the film and that star, or, putting money into the our customers' direct-to-consumer, initiatives.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to. There was a question that came in, and Anthony, maybe we'll start with you. It's kind of the sort of the, I talk a lot about this in my research. It's kind of the talk versus walk, right? The fact that, some topics get a lot of discussion, but then when kind of, the time comes to put your money where your mouth is, there isn't necessarily a lot of investment in sort of, IT capabilities or business capabilities. So I'm curious, from your perspective, Anthony, I mean, how are CP companies investing in this space? Is it internal? Is it external? I guess I'm putting you on the spot a bit. It's probably a horribly unfair question, but what is the sort of the profile of that kind of typical investment, if there is one?
No, I mean, it is a very good question, and the short answer is there is no single right answer, because it is obviously it's highly dependent on each company's specific situation. For example, their product category and the propensity to buy items in that category, online or not, is one of the bigger drivers. Also, their relationship with their retailers, their traditional retailers. There's a channel conflict is still an issue that has to be considered. Just to raise two, characteristics or factors to consider. But I do think that there's been sort of two, let's say three major camps, and people need to kind of figure out where they fall in. One is a camp on the sort of relatively small investment scale, where clearly an acknowledgement that direct-to-consumer from a commercial perspective is relevant and is growing and potentially can be a big thing for that company in that category, but is still a relatively small percentage of overall sales, and they prefer that companies in this bucket tend to prefer a small kind of test and learn approach. So typically working with third-party agencies and fulfillment providers to do everything turnkey. So site, marketing, fulfillment, order management, all done outsourced via a network or some set of third parties. On the other end of the spectrum are companies that, for whatever reason, dynamics dictate that they're putting a larger bet behind e-commerce and are looking to create more of a scalable platform to grow on over time. Typically, these companies also are ones that are looking at e-commerce not just from a single geographic perspective, but looking at the taking a global perspective, a multi-geographic perspective at growing e-commerce. And so there are a set of companies that are actually making some very large investments in e-commerce, even though e-commerce is a relatively small proportion of overall revenue, by deploying a set of capabilities and technologies that they believe can be scalable and be a single platform to be simplistic about it, that can grow as the business grows across geos and product categories and whatnot. And then, of course, you have the folks in the middle that are taking a hybrid approach. So I'm working with a number of folks in the middle that are working with third parties in certain geographies to test and learn where they think that speed is of the essence, and that is the approach they want to take, particularly in emerging geographies where e-commerce is exploding. Some kind of working with, are looking at doing whatever can be done as quickly as possible. So taking a hybrid approach where working with third parties in instances like certain emerging markets, but then in other markets where they're interested in taking more of an investment approach, creating a set of capabilities and a platform that they're testing, so they're not fully committed to them yet per se, but there's an eye towards, if everything works out, to roll in some of the markets that they're using third parties for into this platform over time. But they're still not committing per se, or leaving some flexibility open to change approaches as they go down the journey. So where companies sit on that sort of simple spectrum obviously is very dependent on their situation, but there's no single answer, and I see many companies in each of those camps today.
Yep. No. Okay. That makes. And I suppose that sort of. I mean, there's a friend of mine who says everything's a bell curve, right?
Yeah. Right.
There's always your leaders, there's always your laggards, and then there's the sort of the those of us jostling for position in the middle. No, thank you. That was a good summary. So in the interest of time, let me move on to the final topic from the report, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes here on the slides. But I think that from an enterprise planning, from an integrated business planning perspective, I suppose where we've tended to see this at IDC Manufacturing Insights is this sort of tension between the sort of the demand and supply sides of the supply chain, right? The fact that certainly in consumer products, demand volatility is climbing. Sort of demand lead times are shorter and shorter. Brand switching is higher and higher. So you have this kind of increasing speed of the demand side of the supply chain, and then potentially higher levels of complexity and globalization and longer lead times, and so perhaps even sort of almost a slowing of the supply side, which makes that sort of notion of enterprise planning really more important, not less important. And while I think we've all sort of talked over the years about the need to be responsive and flexible and agile, also terms, by the way, in the supply chain Hall of Fame of overused terms. But that sort of that interesting sort of the role of the broader planning initiative in the context of kind of supply and demand, and then sort of I know a lot of folks have used IBP and sales and operations planning, S&OP, interchangeably. I suppose that's with all these things. There is no one right answer. I tend to think of them differently. I tend to think of S&OP very much as that kind of central consensus planning, balancing supply and demand and fulfilling to customers and consumers. And then IBP being then the broader view, right, to include product planning and customer planning and financial planning. But I think it's sort of certainly I think it's certainly something that we're seeing sort of companies start to think a bit differently about, and something that potentially they can use to be more coordinated around and respond to some of these sort of differentiating market pressures, whether in sort of developed and mature economies or in emerging economies. So let me start, if I may, maybe Kara with you, because one of the conversations we had at the event in New York was this sort of notion of kind of what you guys have done around trade promotion, inventory management and optimization, and kind of production planning. And it sort of struck me that was a very interesting example of sort of growing into this broader enterprise planning. Could you talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the sort of some of the challenges that you saw along the way?
Sure. I think especially because Sony is what we would call a mid-range plan company, where they were constantly being asked for forecasts further and further out for the next fiscal years, and how we parsing ourselves or comparing ourselves to how we're going mid-range plan in the current year. We've been trying as an organization to get more to an integrated business plan look at things that is more a holistic view across the entirety of the organization, to help us answer those questions, plan for those questions. So part of that was an initiative to bring, to start feeding promotional data into our I2 demand system, to bring our demand planners as well as our production group online with some of the volatile promotional, estimates. And when you start to talk about promotions, and we tend to run a lot of them, the volatility and the number of SKUs that are included in those promotions is high. So that's been a piece that's been kind of missing in the planning stages over on demand and production for the supply chain. So, but, as you start to talk about that, that's taking what is trade promotions are a very, kind of centric to sales finance, and in some cases marketing or customer marketing. Those are very centric to what we do on a day-to-day basis. And then when you start to feather it into an organization that doesn't necessarily use those terms or use different terms for the same thing, it can be a little challenging and complex, to your point. And I think what we've seen is it is not easy. I think our process has been about 6 months. And, trying to, first of all, you have to define your terms the same way. So what you're talking the same, when you get in a room with 5 different departments, you're speaking the same language. And then build a process that kind of covers from start to finish, from the planning stage at sales, in the sales and marketing's mind, all the way through to how we execute to the customer, which is the build, the ship, the execution, and of course, the throughput when we start to do post street date fulfillment, let's say, on a title or a promotion. So I think where we've kind of seen our biggest issues is really the definition of those terms, defining a cohesive process that runs across what is basically 4 real-time departments, and then trying to execute it at the level, execute at some level. So I think one of the things we found anecdotally when we went live was, and I don't know how this didn't come out in design, but our demand planners were looking at one of our major customers on a weekly basis, whereas the planners are looking at it more from a joint business planning perspective on how the customer looks at it. So they're planning in 3-month tranches, 1-month tranche, or maybe a weekly tranche, depending on how the customer is looking at their promotion cycle. And then you feather in our title life cycle, and it gets even more complex. But even that was a huge timing disjunct between the 2 departments that had to be addressed right away to make sure that they were reading the data they were getting correctly, and putting in their demand requirements, and making sure that we were also able to have the product available. And so it's not, I think it's central to actually becoming a very well-oiled machine and actually managing inventory, which is one of our biggest issues. Managing inventory, having inventory available, and making sure it can get out of the warehouse, in a quick nature. And just in time for customers that require just in time. It's not easy, and I think it seems easy, but it's not. And you need all of the components speaking the same language, agreeing to a process, agreeing to how you joint business plan with your customer, and then feather that into your overall production plans. And again, it's certainly worthwhile. I think we've seen some benefits, some huge benefits in accuracy, but you also have to understand that there are different things driving departments, because one of the biggest things demand had an issue with was, well, we're not going to meet our SLAs. Okay, well, maybe we need to redefine your SLAs because now you're relying on a system. But those are all things that have to be worked out ahead of time and understood. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how we've looked at it, and kind of some of the little tweaks that we've had to make along the way to make it work.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting, and it also and there's actually a question from the audience about sort of this notion of kind of process versus technology. So maybe Anthony, I'll ask you if you can sort of chime in on that one. I mean, I had written some years ago that I thought S&OP was kind of 90% process and 10% technology, and I always kind of regretted writing that because it's kind of that it's out there for all time. And I think perhaps it's not quite that extreme, but is it still largely that sort of that IBP it's about process and people and governance with technology then layered on top? Is it still kind of that? Is that still kind of the way the companies start? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and just as Kara mentioned, it really begins with things like performance management or metrics, and culture, right? Trying to move from a relationship-based selling model to more analytic-based model, as an example, right? As part of these initiatives, to be more demand-driven, if you will, is a huge cultural and process change and has lots of implications. And while I probably agree with you that the 90-10 distribution may be a little bit extreme, you're not far off. So it's actually, kudos to you that you have it out there, because it's pretty close. We have seen, as an industry, we all have seen, the baskets of failed S&OP and IBP, whatever you want to call it, initiatives at clients precisely because they didn't get the process and org and governance related aspects of it right, and tried to implement or deploy more of a technology-led process or technology-led implementation of capabilities, and that's exactly the wrong approach. So when we typically work with clients, we very much say it all starts with metrics, governance, and culture, and then everything kind of falls from that. And likewise, I think, to the very beginning conversation, to kind of maybe, kind of pull us full circle, I think that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of TPM and TPO fatigue, is that many of those initiatives have been technology-led versus people, process, and org-led, when really when you're trying to fundamentally change the selling model of a company, which is what you're doing when you're doing a large-scale trade-related initiative, you're really getting at the heart of what people do on a day-to-day basis and how they're compensated and how they relate to their customers, and let alone their internal colleagues. And so not getting the people, process, and other aspects right and focusing on the technology is sort of a good way to run into a disaster.
Yeah. Kara, would that be kind of consistent with your experience?
Oh, definitely. I don't think you can actually run any of these systems, do any type of even joint business planning, IVP, without having a solid process that's agreed upon across the organization. It's a huge piece of what you need, and it's a huge culture shift, to Anthony's point. And you have to have an organization that's ready to make that change and willing to invest in that change.
Yep. No, that makes sense. We are closing rapidly on the top of the hour. So Kara, Anthony, thanks for that dialogue around the 4 topics. Fascinating stuff. Let me turn it back to Kara. For any closing comments. I don't know. I may have missed. Maybe there's a particularly juicy question that I missed. But Kara, let me turn it back to you.
No, you've done a great job, and there's never 2 Karas on the phone, so this is a little fun, maybe a little confusing. I just had really one question to kind of sum up. There's a topic that we didn't pick as one of the 4 that we went through today and in the live seminar, which is big data. And it's kind of running underneath a lot of these initiatives. Some would argue it's very different from downstream data. In some cases, I know that those initiatives have actually merged. It's a big part of business planning for a lot of companies, a big part of TPM. So I'm just curious to get your guys' real quick perspective on big data. Is it this different thing that's sitting off by itself, or is it and should it be integrated with everything else we've talked about? Simon, I want to give you a shot at this one.
Okay. I think it's so. I wrote a research report last year, which was kind of around supply chain resiliency and manufacturing resiliency, and I talked a lot about this notion of extreme granularity, right? That there's so many nuances to business these days. There's so much complexity to business these days that you end up really being in this place where you have extreme granularity, and it underpins all of these things, right? It underpins the sort of the evolution from trade promotion management to trade promotion optimization. It underpins the notion of downstream data or upstream data or sidestream data, whatever it may be. It's inherent to direct to consumer in terms of both sort of standard sources of data as well as sort of this massive unstructured data that we maybe don't completely know what to do with. And it underpins sort of the notion of integrated business planning and how I relate inventory to capacity to demand. So I think it's if the 4 topics today are vertical topics, big data is that kind of horizontal enabling requirements that underpins, frankly, all of them.
I tend to agree. Anthony, Kara, any different perspectives, or have you seen it as kind of coming together?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely firmly echo what Simon just said. I think it is sort of the horizontal enabler under a set of vertical capabilities. The only thing I would add just very quickly is that, I do think that there is this convergence, though, or maybe reversion back to the original definition many years ago of demand signals being holistic, external demand signals being not just customer signals, but consumer and shopper-based signals. And I think it's really interesting and invigorating that there are many players that are actively trying to glean insights based on consumer and shopper data, whether it's through social as probably the primary example around innovation and marketing as well as supply chain planning, but not just in silos using social data, but actually building true demand signal repositories that integrate customer demand data with consumer and shopper demand data to realize the vision that we all talked about like 10 years ago, but we kind of started on the customer side. So I find that very invigorating, and there's really great things happening in the industry around that area.
Kara, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I think our structure is basically they've collided into each other. I mean, we look at it as data. So there is no, it underpins everything we do, and we take it into one big warehouse and try to manage it. So I don't see them as separate. I see them as kind of a convergence into data's data, and you just need to figure out how to use it and make sure your goals are clear and develop around what you want to do with it.
Perfect. Okay, closing thoughts from each of you. What is, in 3 words or less, what is the one key initiative, maybe some of the ones that we've talked about today, maybe something else that's in the report, what is the one key initiative in the sales and marketing area that consumer goods companies really need to make sure that they don't drop the ball on? Go ahead, Simon. Start with you.
I was going to say, maybe I'll start. I think to me, it's direct to consumer. I mean, I think it's the shift of power, I think, from manufacturers to retailers. I mean, it's a chart, Kara, you and I have talked about for a decade, right?
Yep.
That shift from manufacturers to retailers to consumers, I think, is complete, almost complete. We all talk about customer centricity, chief executive consumer, whatever the term is. So how manufacturers and retailers manage to that end consumer, I think it's direct to consumer in whatever guise it ultimately takes.
Okay. Anthony, one initiative.
Yeah, and basically the same thing. I would only just rephrase it. We would call it consumer engagement, right? Because it is holistic, not just sort of from a commerce perspective, but the entire brand experience end to end throughout the new shopping journey, I think, is the one thing that CPG companies need to get right.
Okay, Kara. It's hard to go last. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. And I think I'm going to make a general statement, and I think where a lot of people I've heard have struggled, and I know we have struggled, is taking in data, creating insights, and actually creating actions. I think trying to figure out the bridging the insight to action piece has been a challenge, and that's where you're going to actually start to move the needle on your gross profit percentages and growing your business and whatnot. And that could be in the consumer, direct-to-consumer space, in your business planning space, your JBP space. But being able to glean your insights and create action out of them, I think it's the biggest challenge I know we've faced. So
absolutely. Okay, well, I want to thank my panelists for their time today. I want to thank IBM for sponsoring this event, Simon Ellis from IDC, Kara Taylor from Sony Pictures Home Entertainment, Anthony Bigornia from IBM. A replay will be available on our website for lots of different platforms, and we look forward to having future conversations with you all around these topics. So have a great day.